The Alberta Prosperity Project has announced the official separation referendum question it hopes to pose to citizens.
Alberta Premier Danielle Smith unveiled a freeze to the industrial carbon tax.
The BC NDP government is prohibiting non-Indigenous people from accessing the Joffrey Lakes Provincial Park. Hello Canada, it's Tuesday, May 13th, and this is the True North Daily Brief. I'm Cosmin, Dzsurdzsa.
And I'm Geoff Knight.
We've got you covered with all the news you need to know. Let's discuss the top stories of the day and the True North exclusives you won't hear anywhere else. The Alberta Prosperity Project has unveiled the question it plans to put to Albertans if a citizen-initiated referendum on separation from Canada proceeds. Constitutional lawyer and general counsel with the Alberta Prosperity Project, Geoffrey Rath, announced the proposed referendum question on Monday. The question reads, quote, "Do you agree that the province of Alberta shall become a sovereign country and cease to be a province of Canada?" The group is currently collecting signatures as part of a pre-registration effort required to submit a formal referendum petition with Elections Alberta. Due to technical issues, live updates on the signature count have been suspended. However, as of Monday, the Alberta Prosperity Project has secured at least 240,000 signatures. While the province has proposed legislation to lower the legal referendum signatures threshold from 600,000 to 177,000, the bill has yet to pass. Therefore, the Alberta Prosperity Project still has its targets set on the 600,000 goal, although it will likely be reduced to 177,000 shortly. The organization, a nonpartisan group, outlined a roadmap to sovereignty. First, the group aims to educate Albertans on the significance of sovereignty and the process for accomplishing it. Next, it plans to collect 600,000 signatures within 90 days. Again, this is based on previous legislation and will likely soon change to 177,000 signatures within 120 days. While progressing towards the referendum, the project said it would support political leaders who align with the goal of sovereignty. The key initiatives proposed by the group are establishing an Alberta pension plan and a provincial police force. The project also calls for the province to have greater authority over immigration management, tax collection, and employment insurance. Geoff, since the election of Mark Carney as Prime Minister at the federal level, there has been an explosion in interest in Alberta separation and sovereignty. And there are quite a few groups, if I'm not mistaken, that have emerged or were pre-existing before this happened. So, Geoff, could you just enlighten our listeners, what are some of the other groups attempting to introduce a separation referendum or approaching Alberta sovereignty politically?
Yeah, Cosmin, the Alberta Prosperity Project's referendum push isn't the only effort in Alberta challenging the province's ties to Canada. There's several groups that are pushing separation or greater sovereignty through various means. The Independent Party of Alberta, a registered political party, advocates for Alberta's full independence through electoral politics, focusing on negotiating with Ottawa for control over taxation, pensions, and immigration, as outlined on their website in March 2024. They ran candidates in the 2023 provincial election, but didn't secure seats. Similarly, the Wild Rose Independence Party, active since 2020, pushes for outright independence, with their 2023 platform calling for withdrawing from the Canada Pension Plan and creating an Alberta Revenue Agency, capturing 2.3% of the vote in that election. Other groups take a broader approach to sovereignty within Confederation. Alberta First focuses on grassroots advocacy, urging Alberta to assert autonomy by opting out of federal programs like the Canada Health Act and drafting a provincial constitution. They've held town halls with 5,000 attendees in 2023. The Freedom Conservative Party of Alberta, though smaller, has supported a sovereignty referendum since 2019, advocating for a Sovereignty Act to nullify federal laws, a concept echoed in Premier Danielle Smith's Alberta Sovereignty within a United Canada Act passed in December 2022. These groups collectively highlight a range of strategies, political, grassroots, and legislative, aiming to either separate from Canada or secure greater provincial autonomy. The Alberta government is freezing its industrial carbon tax at $95 per ton of emissions to protect businesses from growing uncertainty caused by the ongoing tariff war. The province argues it can reduce emissions through technological innovation, not unrealistically high taxes as required by the federal government. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith and Environment Minister Rebecca Schultz announced the freeze Monday, halting a planned increase to $110 per ton in 2026 and a further rise to $170 per ton by 2030 under the province's Technology, Innovation, and Emissions Reduction Regulation. Smith said she heard the concerns of business and industry leaders who were warning that further tax hikes would harm Alberta's competitiveness and be detrimental to their businesses. Smith said, quote, Alberta remains committed to reducing emissions through the development and implementation of new technologies, not unrealistically high taxes, while responsibly powering the world for decades to come. Since 2007, Alberta has reduced emissions from the oil sands by over 22%, while simultaneously increasing oil production by 90%. Meanwhile, the province's overall emissions have decreased by about 7.2%. Smith said, quote, if industry told us that any increase past $100 per ton would be harmful, you can imagine what $170 per ton industrial carbon tax would do to our industry. That would be devastating to Alberta's economy. This is yet another example of Ottawa overstepping into our provincial jurisdiction with reckless policies that damage our industry. The Premier explained that the tax freeze would help not just the energy industry, but also agriculture, forestry, petrochemicals, and more. Schultz said energy demand is soaring globally, and the world wants Alberta's resources, but Ottawa's climate agenda has made investment more difficult. Smith pointed to Quebec's lower carbon price as further evidence of unequal treatment under Ottawa's climate framework and urged the federal government to abandon its ideological approach. So, Cosmin, how has Prime Minister Mark Carney advertised the industrial carbon tax? Has he acknowledged the cost to industries?
So yeah, Geoff, we all recall back during the federal election when Carney suddenly turned around and joined the so-called Axe the Tax crowd by axing the consumer carbon tax. Or rather, he didn't actually axe it because the legislation is still in effect. That's why we're talking about an industrial carbon tax today. But he reduced the consumer carbon tax to zero, making a big show of it as one of his election promises. But now we see that the problem of the carbon tax has not actually gone away, because the industrial carbon tax, it essentially affects everything we consume, we purchase at the store, anything that travels using fossil fuels on a truck, on an airplane, on a vessel, etc. And essentially, Mark Carney has spoken out of both sides of his mouth when it comes to the carbon tax. In an attempt to take some of the popularity, or rather the wind, out of his conservative opponent during the election, he wanted to position himself as somebody who opposed the carbon tax, or at least the consumer carbon tax. But as I just mentioned, the industrial carbon tax is a consumer carbon tax as well, because we pay for it at the end of the day. Industries are going to pass on that cost to consumers. But in terms of the way he has essentially advertised it, he's said several things which don't actually stand up to scrutiny. For example, he's called it a competitive edge for industries. When we have business and industry leaders across the country, not only in Alberta, saying that the industrial carbon tax reduces competitiveness, it doesn't actually promote it. And additionally, the industrial carbon tax is set to increase. The federal government has not paused increases on the industrial carbon tax. So in many ways, Carney has attempted to gain favor from the electorate, but now, after the election, after everything is all said and done, we are still left with this industrial carbon tax. It is raising the prices of things. There was a temporary reprieve from that consumer carbon tax reduction, but the prices continue to escalate as the industrial carbon tax also goes up. The British Columbia NDP government has banned non-Indigenous Canadians from accessing a provincial park until the end of the week. Joffrey Lakes Provincial Park has been off-limits to visitors since April 26th, so local First Nations can, quote, connect with the park despite it being Crown land. Located approximately 35 kilometers east of Pemberton along Highway 99, Joffrey Lakes Provincial Parks is known for its awe-inspiring landscapes and serene ambience. However, BC Park says the park will remain off-limits to recreational visitors until at least May 17th. In a statement released by BC Parks, the agency said the closure aims to, quote, recognize the importance of the Joffrey Lakes Park area to the two Indigenous communities and to provide them with dedicated time, quote, to connect with the land. Former BC United candidate Caroline Elliott raised concerns about broader implications in an ex post on Friday, suggesting the decision to close the park on the basis of, quote, traditional territory could signal a lurch away from the basic principle of Western property rights. Day use access to the park will resume on Saturday, at which point visitors aged 12 and up will again be required to book a free day use pass in advance. The decision to restrict non-Indigenous access to the park follows the BC government's decision to recognize the Haida Nation's Aboriginal title to all of Haida Gwaii. The agreement, signed in April 2024 and reconfirmed by the federal government in February, affirms Haida Indigenous ownership over the archipelago, including lands, freshwater bodies, and foreshore to the low tide mark. Critics have raised concerns that the decision ignores the property rights of non-Indigenous landowners who were not consulted on the land title change. So for those who are not from BC or are not aware of this, essentially the BC government has entered into agreement with the Haida Gwaii First Nations to give them title over the entirety of a massive piece of land. It's a huge piece of land, today known as Haida Gwaii, and not only the land, but the surrounding waters. Now, there has been quite a bit of legal criticism. There hasn't been that many outspoken activists against it because of the sensitivity of the conversation, but there are quite a few legal criticisms, Geoff, and if you could just go through some of the available criticisms to the Haida Gwaii land title claim.
Yeah, the BC NDP's closure of Joffrey Lakes Provincial Park to non-Indigenous visitors mirrors the controversial Haida Gwaii land title agreement, and the criticisms of that deal shed light on similar tensions. The Haida Nation's Aboriginal title to Haida Gwaii, recognized by the BC government in April 2024 and reaffirmed by the federal government in February, has faced significant pushback. The provincial opposition BC Conservative Party criticized the agreement, arguing it puts private landowners at the mercy of Haida and future Haida Indigenous law. They contend that the deal undermines non-Indigenous property rights by potentially subjecting the landowners to new governance structures without their input, raising fears of diminished control over their own land. Further criticism centers on the lack of consultation and clarity. While the agreement states existing private property interests will be honored, it still creates uncertainty for non-Indigenous residents, as the transition process for land and resource management remains undefined. Lawyer Jeffrey Rath, who has also been involved with the Alberta Prosperity Project, echoed this in a Western Standard piece from May the 1st, arguing that the agreement prioritizes Indigenous title over established Western property law principles, potentially setting a precedent for other regions like Joffrey Lakes. Critics, including former BC United candidate Caroline Elliott, fear this reflects a broader trend, where public access and non-Indigenous rights are sidelined under the guise of reconciliation, without significant transparency or consideration for all stakeholders. These concerns highlight a tension between Indigenous recognition and the perceived erosion of non-Indigenous property rights.
That's it for today, folks. Thanks for tuning in. You can stay on top of new episodes every weekday by subscribing to the Daily Brief on iTunes and Spotify. Also, while you're at it, make sure to hit us with a 5-star rating and please leave a review.